The rain had been falling since sunset, a cold, slanting drizzle that turned the Texas prairie into a dark expanse of sucking mud and black water. Wind moaned through the mesquite, rattling the cabin shutters Samuel Price had nailed down earlier. That day, most sensible folk were huddled by their fires, waiting for the storm to pass. But Samuel was still out, riding the southern fence line, lantern swinging from his saddle, checking for gaps the cattle might wander through. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with weathered hands and eyes that had grown used to looking at far-off horizons. The frontier had taught him that trouble came quickest when you weren't expecting it. So even on nights like this, when the wind seemed to drive the rain sideways, he made his rounds. That was when he saw it a shape moving along the trail ahead. At first, he thought it was a calf strayed from the herd, its small frame stooped and struggling. But as he drew closer, the light from his lantern revealed something else entirely. A child. She was no more than 12 or 13, barefoot in the sucking mud, soaked to the skin. Her dark hair clung in wet strands to her face, and she hugged her thin arms to her chest as if trying to hold in what little warmth she had left. Samuel's horse buck snorted at the sight, hooves splashing as they drew near. Samuel swung down from the saddle. "Hey there," he called over the wind, keeping his voice low, steady. "You lost?" The girl didn't answer. Her eyes dark and wide flicked up to meet his for only a second before darting away again. He could see the faint paint smears on her cheeks, now streaked and running from the rain. Even without them, he would have known Comanche in this part of Texas. That meant trouble, not because of the people themselves, but because of the uneasy balance between settlers and the tribes. A misunderstanding could light a fire no one could put out. Still, Samuel didn't hesitate. "You'll freeze out here," he said, stepping closer. The girl flinched back a half step, but her legs buckled in the mud. Instinct took over. Samuel reached for her gently, lifting her as easily as a sack of grain. She was light too light, and her skin felt ice cold through the soaked fabric of her dress. He swung her up onto Buck's saddle, then climbed in behind her. The girl sat rigid, not leaning back, but she didn't try to run. Samuel took that as a small mercy. The trail to his cabin was half a mile, but the storm made it feel longer. Rain lashed his face, stinging like grit. Buck's hooves slogged through the muck, each step a heavy pull. Samuel kept one arm braced around the girl so she wouldn't slip, and with the other he guided the reins toward the faint orange glow in the distance, his cabin window dot by the time they reached the small corral. His coat was soaked through, and the girl was shivering violently. Samuel swung down, lifted her again, and carried her inside without a word. The cabin was warm, the fire low but steady. He set her down near the hearth and tossed another log onto the flames. The shadows leapt higher, throwing light across the choice. Single-room space wooden table, bed in the corner, shelves lined with jars of dried beans and salt pork. She sat where he placed her, eyes darting around like a wild animal caught in a trap. Samuel moved slowly, untying his wet slicker and hanging it by the door. "Name Samuel Price," he said, crouching near the fire. "I ain't gonna hurt you." Still, she said nothing. Her gaze flicked to the door as if measuring the distance. Samuel noticed her feet red, raw from the cold, caked in mud. He stood, fetched an old wool blanket from the bed, and draped it around her shoulders. She didn't resist, but she didn't thank him either. He hadn't expected her to. Samuel poured a tin cup of hot water from the kettle and set it beside her. Steam curled upward, carrying the faint scent of chamomile. "You drink that. Get some heat in you," he said. She hesitated, then reached for it with trembling fingers. The way she cradled the cup told him she needed the warmth as much as the water. Outside, the rain beat harder against the roof. The wind rattled the shutters like a warning Samuel couldn't quite read. He had no idea who this girl was, where she'd come from, or why she'd been alone in the storm. But one thing was certain: bringing her here had already set something in motion. And whatever it was coming fast. The fire had burned high for an hour, drying the worst of the rain from Samuel's clothes. The girl, wrapped in the wool blanket, sat cross-legged on the floorboards just beyond the reach of the flames. Every now and then, her eyes would flicker toward him, quick and wary, like a doe watching a hunter from the tree line. Samuel busied himself with small tasks, hanging his wet coat, stowing his rifle back in its rack, stirring the pot of beans that had been simmering before he left to check the fence. The air in the cabin was warm now, but he knew the cold was slow to leave. The bones. He glanced at her feet, still red and raw from the mud, and made a note to fetch some salve before the night was over. "You eat?" he asked, ladling beans into a tin bowl. The girl didn't answer, didn't even look at the food at first. She held the blanket tighter, shoulders hunched. Samuel set the bowl on the floor between them and returned to his chair. "Not poisoned," he said dryly. "I've been eatin' from that pot 2 nights now." Her gaze dropped to the beans. Slowly, cautiously, she reached for the spoon and tasted a small bite, then another. By the 5th, the pace quickened, and Samuel had to hide a faint smile. Hunger was a language even strangers understood. Outside, the wind screamed along the eaves, and somewhere out in the dark, a branch cracked under the weight of the rain. Samuel's eyes flicked to the shuttered windows. This stretch of the prairie had a way of turning shadows into trouble when a man least expected it. "You got folks nearby?" he asked after a while. Her spoon paused mid-air, then lowered back into the bowl without a word. Samuel leaned back in his chair. "Not trying to pry. Just don't seem right for you to be walking out there alone in this weather." The only reply was the soft clink of the spoon in the tin bowl. He tried again. "You understand me?" She lifted her eyes, studying him, then gave a small, careful nod. That was something. "All right," he said, rubbing his jaw. "Then you understand I ain't keepin' you here. Soon as it's light, we'll see about getting you home. Wherever that is." For a moment, she stared at him as though weighing the truth in his words. Then she went back to eating. Samuel fetched a small jar of pine-scented salve and knelt beside her. "Let me see your feet." Her grip on the blanket tightened. He waited, patient, until at last she extended one bare foot toward him. The skin was chapped and raw, the nails cracked. He worked the salve in gently, the scent of resin filling the cabin. She didn't flinch, but she didn't meet his eyes either. By the time he finished, her bowl was empty. Samuel set it aside, then reached for the kettle to pour himself more coffee. That's when he heard it, a faint thud from outside, too heavy for rain. His hand froze on the coffee pot. The girl heard it too. Her head turned sharply toward the door, her shoulders tensed. Samuel stood, moving quietly to the rifle rack. He took the Winchester down and checked the chamber. "Stay here," he murmured. He stepped to the door and cracked it open. The rain was lighter now, but the darkness beyond was thick, swallowing the lantern light from the porch. He scanned the yard, the corral, the water trough, the woodpile. Nothing moved. Still, the uneasy feeling crawled up his spine. He'd been on the frontier long enough to know when he was being watched. Closing the door, he replaced the rifle but kept it within reach. The girl hadn't moved, but her eyes followed him. "Just the wind," he lied, not sure if he was trying to convince her or himself. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. Samuel sat back down, watching her over the rim of his coffee cup. She didn't speak again before curling up on the floor, blanket pulled over her head. He let her be. But long after her breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep, Samuel stayed awake, listening to the restless wind and wondering if someone or something out there already knew she was here. Samuel woke before dawn as he always did, though he doubted he'd slept more than a few hours. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, painting the cabin in a dim red light. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the land was holding its breath. The girl was still wrapped in the blanket on the floor, her small form curled tight. Samuel eased from his bed and stoked the fire until flames began licking at the fresh logs. The warmth crept back into the room, carrying with it the smell of smoke and pine. He stepped outside for a moment, pulling on his coat. The air was crisp, washed clean by the storm, and the sky above the eastern hills was beginning to pale. The prairie stretched in every direction, slick with rain, the grass bending under the weight of water. He scanned the tree line, his eyes trained to pick out anything that didn't belong. Nothing moved. Still, the uneasy feeling from the night before lingered. Back inside, the girl had stirred. She sat up slowly, the blanket sliding from her shoulders, revealing a tattered buckskin dress. Her hair, now dry, hung in thick waves around her face. "Morning," Samuel said, keeping his tone gentle. She didn't reply, but her eyes tracked him as he poured water into the kettle and set it over the fire. "You got a name?" he asked. For a moment, he thought she'd ignore him again. Then she spoke soft, hesitant, as if the words cost her something. "Naya," Samuel nodded. "That's a fine name." She looked away, clearly unsure if she'd made a mistake in telling him. He decided not to push. "Well, Naya, soon as we get some food in us, we'll see about finding where your people are. Might be they're looking for you." Her head snapped back toward him, eyes wide, almost fearful. He couldn't tell if it was the idea of being found, or the thought of who might be doing the finding, that scared her more. Samuel ladled oatmeal into 2 bowls, adding a drizzle of honey from the jar he kept tucked away for rare occasions. He slid 1 bowl across to her and sat down with his own. She ate slowly this time, as though lost in thought. When they finished, Samuel went out to check the stock. The corral was muddy but intact, and the horses had weathered the storm fine. The cattle, however, were restless, more so than they should have been after a night in the pen. They shifted and snorted, bunching together as though something beyond the fence unsettled them. Samuel scanned the hills again. That's when he saw it, a flicker of movement far in the distance, just at the edge of the tree line. It could have been a deer, could have been the wind, but every instinct in him told him otherwise. He turned back toward the cabin, his jaw tightening. Inside, Naya was standing near the window, staring out toward the same distant ridge. She didn't move when he entered. "You see something?" he asked. Her hands tightened on the blanket still draped around her. "They're here," she whispered. Samuel froze. "Who's they?" She didn't answer, just turned from the window and sat back on the floor, knees pulled up to her chest. He stepped to the window and looked again toward the hills. The movement was gone now, swallowed by the trees. Samuel stayed close to the cabin for the rest of the morning, doing small chores but keeping his rifle within arm's reach. Naya remained inside, quiet and withdrawn, glancing toward the door every time the wind stirred. By midday, the sun broke through, throwing light across the prairie. Samuel was out by the woodpile splitting logs when he caught it again. This time, no mistake. A figure on horseback far off, a-watching. Then another. Then another. They didn't approach. They just sat there, distant and still, as if measuring the space between them and the cabin. When Samuel finally went inside, Naya was waiting by the table, her expression grave. "My father," she said softly. "He will come." Samuel studied her, understanding dawning in slow, heavy pieces. Whoever her father was, he wouldn't be coming alone. And for the first time since last night, Samuel began to wonder if bringing her here might cost him far more than a few hours. Sleep. By late afternoon, the air had changed. It wasn't just warmer, it was heavier, as if the land itself knew something was coming. Samuel had lived through his share of hard weather and harder men, and the feeling crawling between his shoulder blades wasn't one he could ignore. The first rider appeared just as the sun dipped low over the prairie. He emerged from the tree. Lying a quarter-mile off, horse black as coal, rider's face painted with streaks of red and white. Then another rider appeared, and another. Within minutes, the horizon was alive with motion. Horses broke from the trees in small groups, fanning out, their riders moving with a precision that was anything but casual. Samuel counted as best he could, his jaw tightening with each new arrival, 10, 20, 30. By the time the last riders emerged, the number was closer to 70. He set down the axe he'd been using to split logs, every muscle in his body telling him to go for the Winchester. But he didn't, not yet. The riders didn't charge. They came in slow, deliberate, circling the cabin at a distance. The sound of hooves rolled like distant thunder, steady and sure. Samuel could feel it in the ground beneath his boots. Inside, Naya stood by the window, her hands clutching the blanket so tightly her knuckles whitened. She didn't look frightened, at least not in the way a child might. This was something. Deeper, older. "They found you," Samuel said, his voice low. She didn't reply. Just turned toward the door, her dark eyes unreadable. The circle tightened. Warriors rode 3 deep now, their painted faces glinting in the fading light. Some carried lances decorated with feathers that fluttered in the wind. Others held rifles, the barrels catching the sun. Then the ring of riders parted, and one man rode forward. He was taller than the rest, his horse a towering paint stallion. His hair was long, black, and braided with strips of red cloth. Eagle feathers trailed from the crown of his head, moving like the wind itself. He wore a breastplate of bone and leather, each piece carved and polished to a shine. His gaze was fixed on Samuel with the sharpness of a hawk locking onto prey. Naya stepped forward. Her lips moved as if to speak, but Samuel held up a hand. "Stay here." He stepped out onto the porch, squinting against the setting sun. The leader reined in his horse a few paces away. The air between them seemed to stretch tight, like a rope about to snap. The man's voice was deep and steady when he spoke. "I am Lone Bear, chief of the Noconi Comanche. You have my daughter." Samuel kept his own voice even. "She came to my door last night in the storm, alone, half frozen. I gave her shelter. That's all." The chief's eyes narrowed. White man does not take a Comanche child into his house without reason." "I didn't take her," Samuel said, choosing his words carefully. "I found her. She was near dead. Figured a warm fire and a roof was better than letting her freeze in the mud." Lone Bear's gaze flicked toward the window where Naya now stood, her face pale. The warriors behind him shifted, some tightening their reins, others watching with cold stillness. "You will bring her to me," Lone Bear said. "Now?" Samuel hesitated. He knew the smart move would be to hand her over without another word, but there was something in Naya's eyes last night and again this morning that told him it wasn't that simple. "Before I do," Samuel said slowly, "maybe she should tell you how she got here." The chief's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Samuel glanced toward the door. "Naya, come on out." She stepped onto the porch, the blanket still around her shoulders. For a moment, she stood between them, her small frame caught in the shadow of 2 worlds. She began speaking in Comanche, her voice low but urgent. Samuel couldn't understand the words, but he could read the effect. The warriors behind Lone Bear shifted again, some lowering their weapons slightly. Lone Bear's expression didn't change, but his eyes moved from his daughter to Samuel with something less than pure fury now, though not by much. When she finished, the chief sat silent for a long moment. Then he spoke again, his voice colder than before. "You say you saved her," Lone Bear said. "Then prove your honor. Ride with us to our camp. Bring her home yourself." The warriors closed the circle once more, leaving Samuel with the clear understanding this wasn't a request. Samuel weighed his options, though in truth there weren't many. 70 armed warriors on horseback were not the sort of company a man argued with for long. Lone Bear sat tall on his paint stallion, eyes never leaving Samuel, his hand resting lightly on the reins as if even the smallest movement might be a signal for attack. "All right," Samuel said at last, his voice even. "I'll ride with you." The chief gave a single sharp nod. "Now." Samuel turned to Naya. "You're ridden with me." She hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping toward Buck. The warriors opened a narrow path, their horses shifting with restless energy as Samuel led her to the saddle. He swung up behind her, the Winchester resting in its scabbard but close enough for comfort. "Lone?" Bear gave a signal, just a flick of his wrist, and the ring of warriors began to move. Samuel found himself surrounded, 2 riders at his sides, more in front and behind. The group set off at a steady pace, hooves pounding the wet ground, their formation precise, almost military. The prairie opened before them, endless and glistening from the storm. The air smelled of damp earth and grass, but beneath it was something sharper, a tension that hung between Samuel and the 70 men who could end his life without hesitation. They rode in silence for the first mile. Samuel's mind worked over the situation, the weight of the moment pressing hard. Lone Bear had called this a test of honor, but Samuel knew better. It was also a measure of trust, or the lack of it. At his side, a warrior no older than 20 glanced at him, his face painted in swirls of blue and white. Samuel gave a slight nod in greeting. The young man didn't return it. Naya sat stiff in the saddle, eyes fixed on the vast horizon. Samuel leaned down just enough for his voice to reach her over the hoofbeats. "You all right?" She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, it was barely above a whisper. "He thinks you took me." Samuel's jaw tightened. "And you told him otherwise?" "Yes, but he says words are wind." Samuel almost smiled despite the tension. "That's about right." The trail bent toward a shallow valley, and the riders spread out along the slope, their silhouettes black against the fading light. The chief rode ahead now, his stallion moving with effortless grace, the eagle feathers in his hair streaming behind him. At the valley floor, they crossed a narrow creek, its banks swollen from the rain. Samuel's boots filled with cold water, and Buck snorted at the chill. The Comanche riders didn't so much as flinch. When they climbed the far slope, the sun had dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. That's when Samuel saw it, faint wisps of smoke rising in the distance. "Camp," Naya murmured. As they drew nearer, the sounds of life began to carry across the open ground, dogs barking, children laughing, the muted thud of a drum. Camp came into view all at once, like stepping through a door. Dozens of tipis stood in a wide circle, their hides painted with scenes of hunts and battles. Women moved between them, tending fires, grinding corn, or hanging wet hides to dry. Moment the riders entered, every eye turned to Samuel. Conversations halted. Children froze mid-step. He felt the weight of those stares like arrows in his back. Lone Bear dismounted first, then gestured for Samuel to follow. "You will speak with me inside my lodge," the chief said. Samuel swung down, helping Naya to the ground. She moved quickly to her father's side, but not before giving Samuel a brief, unreadable look. The warriors began to disperse, though several remained close, their presence a silent reminder that he was deep. Inside their world now, far from the safety of his cabin. As Lone Bear led him toward the largest tipi, Samuel kept his face calm, his steps steady. He knew this was the moment where every word he spoke would matter. Somewhere behind him, Buck whickered softly, and Samuel found himself thinking, if this went bad, that sound might be the last thing he ever heard. The inside of Lone Bear's lodge was warm and dim, lit by a small fire at its center. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and the faint tang of sage. Painted buffalo hides lined the walls, their designs telling stories of hunts, raids, and seasons past. Lone Bear sat cross-legged near the fire, gesturing for Samuel to do the same. Naya settled silently beside her father, eyes downcast. Two older warriors entered and stood by the flap, silent as stone. Their hands rested on the hafts of their lances, not threatening, but not idle either. For a long while, Lone Bear said nothing. He simply studied Samuel, his gaze weighing, measuring. Samuel held it, knowing that any sign of weakness here would echo louder than words. Finally, the chief spoke. "A man's actions are a trail he leaves behind. Yours has crossed mine." Samuel kept his voice steady. "Didn't come looking for that. I found your daughter in the rain. She'd have died out there." Naya glanced up briefly, but Lone Bear's eyes never left Samuel's face. "You could have left her. Most white men would have. Some might have kept her." His tone sharpened on that last word. Samuel felt his jaw tighten. "That ain't me." "Words are wind," Lone Bear said, leaning forward. "If you are a man of honor, you will prove it." Samuel waited. "My daughter was not simply lost." Lone Bear continued. "She was taken by a band of traders who moved between the settlements and our hunting grounds. They bring whiskey, guns, and lies. She escaped them in the storm, but they will return for her." Samuel frowned. "Traders? I didn't see anyone near my land." "They are clever," Lone Bear said. "They know the hills, and they know how to vanish. But they know you have her now, and they will believe you are their enemy." Samuel leaned back slightly, absorbing the weight of it. "So you think bringing me here keeps her safe?" Lone Bear's expression didn't change. "It shows my people I have her. It shows you are not hiding her for yourself. But the traders must see this too. That is why you will ride with me tomorrow to meet them." Samuel's brows knit. "And if I say no?" One of the warriors by the door shifted his stance, the movement slow but unmistakable. "You will not," Lone Bear said simply. Naya finally spoke, her voice quick and urgent in Comanche. Lone Bear listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he nodded once. "She says you treated her with respect, that you did not ask her questions she did not wish to answer, that you gave her food and warmth without asking for anything in return." Samuel gave a short nod. "That's the truth." The chief's gaze softened slightly. "Then you will have the chance to keep your honor. When we meet the traders, you will speak for yourself. If they believe you are innocent, you will ride home in peace." "And if they don't?" Samuel asked. Lone Bear's voice dropped to something colder. "Then they will not leave the prairie alive." Silence settled over the lodge, the kind that carries weight. Finally, Lone Bear rose to his feet. "You will eat and rest here tonight. At first light, we ride." The warriors stepped aside, allowing Samuel to follow a younger man who had appeared at the flap. Outside, the camp had settled into the rhythms of evening, children darting between fires, dogs circling for scraps, women tending to hides and kettles. Samuel was shown to a smaller tipi, where a mat of furs and a folded blanket awaited him. He sat down heavily, the day's events pressing in on him. Somewhere across the camp, Naya's voice carried faintly, speaking to her kin. He stared at the fire pit in the center of the small lodge, wondering what the traders knew, what they wanted, and how far they were willing to go. One thing was certain: if this meeting turned ugly, he'd be standing between two sides with nothing but his word and the steel in his hands. And on the frontier, sometimes that wasn't nearly enough. The pale morning light had barely touched the horizon when Samuel opened his eyes. The room was still dim, the fire reduced to glowing embers, but a strange stillness hung in the air, too still for morning on the frontier. No birdsong, no wind. No sound of cattle stirring in the corral. Just silence, heavy and unnatural. He pushed himself up from the chair where he'd dozed off. The Comanche girl, Taya, still lay beneath the quilt, her breathing steady now, her face less pale than the night before. Samuel moved quietly so as not to wake her, but something in him, a rancher's instinct sharpened by years of survival, pulled him toward the window. The moment his eyes landed outside, his heart skipped a beat. They were there, dozens of them, their silhouettes stark against the faint light of dawn. Warriors on horseback. Painted faces, long braids trailing over shoulders, rifles and lances gleaming. They formed a half circle around the cabin, silent, motionless, their horses shifting. In the cold, Samuel counted quickly 40. 50, no more. By the time he reached the far side, the number was closer to 70. At their center sat a man unlike the rest, taller, broader, his black hair bound with eagle feathers, his face marked with deep lines of age and authority. The way the others held themselves around him made it clear this was their chief. And Samuel had no doubt whose father he was. Samuel stepped back from the window, his mind racing. He'd been in close calls before, run-ins with outlaws, disputes over cattle, the occasional trouble with settlers and tribes alike, but this was different. This wasn't a warning party. This was a force, and it had come for a reason. He checked the rifle by the door loaded. The revolver on the shelf also loaded. But the thought of using them now seemed less like protection and more like suicide. Behind him, a small voice spoke. "They've come for me." Samuel turned. Taya was sitting up, her dark eyes steady on him. She didn't look afraid, at least not in the way he expected. More like she'd been waiting for this moment. "I figured," Samuel said, keeping his voice calm. "Your father?" She nodded once. "Hunts the wind." He'd heard the name before, whispered among settlers. A man known for both his cunning and his ferocity. A leader who kept his people alive by never showing weakness, especially to outsiders. Taya's gaze dropped to the floor. "If you let me go, they will leave you alone." Samuel studied her, then glanced toward the door. He could walk her out right now, hand her over, and maybe all of this would end without a drop of blood. It was the logical thing to do, the safe thing, but his gut told him it wasn't that simple. Men like hunts. The wind didn't ride out with 70 warriors just to collect a lost child. There would be questions, accusations. Samuel might not even get the chance to explain before the shooting started. He crouched down beside her. "I'm not about to toss you out there like a sack of grain. Not until I know what's going on." Taya's eyes flickered surprise. Maybe even a hint of trust, but she didn't answer. A loud thud shook the door. A voice followed, deep, commanding, speaking in Comanche. Samuel didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. "Come out." Samuel's jaw tightened. He glanced once more at the rifle, then back at Taya. "Stay here," he told her, his voice low but firm. He stepped outside into the cold dawn, boots sinking in the wet earth. The warrior's eyes tracked him as he moved toward the edge of the porch. Hunts the Wind sat like a statue on his horse, his gaze sharp as a hawk's. The chief spoke, his words low and measured, the Comanche syllables rolling like distant thunder. Samuel shook his head. "Don't speak your tongue," he called back. One of the younger warriors translated, his voice edged with hostility. "You have his daughter. He asks why. And why you kept her through the night." Samuel took a slow breath, steadying himself. This was the moment that would decide everything, whether the day ended with peace or with gunfire. The sun was dipping low over the Texas plains, staining the horizon with gold and crimson. Samuel stood at the threshold of his cabin, watching as the Comanche warriors prepared to depart. Horses pawed at the earth, their dark eyes glinting in the fading light, while warriors tightened saddle straps and checked bows. The air carried the lingering tension of the past days, yet it also held something unspoken. Respect. Chief Greyhawk approached Samuel with measured steps. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a presence that could silence a room. His deep-set eyes studied Samuel for a long moment before he spoke. "You sheltered my daughter when she was alone," he said in English, the words heavy with meaning. "You fed her, gave her warmth. You did not harm her. For this, you have my gratitude." Samuel nodded slowly, unsure if words would suffice. "She was cold and afraid," he said. "No man with a conscience would have left her out there." A flicker of something, perhaps surprise, crossed Greyhawk's face. "Many men with conscience have done far worse to my people," the chief replied. "But you are not them." He glanced toward the girl, who now stood barefoot in the grass, watching the exchange with quiet eyes. Her small hands were clasped at her front, and her hair, once matted with rain, now hung neatly down her back. Samuel cleared his throat. "I reckon you'll be taking her back home now." "Yes," Greyhawk said, his voice gentler now. "But know this, Samuel Price, your home is known to the Comanche. Should trouble ever come, send word." He placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, not lightly, but with the weight of a vow. 70 warriors will ride for you." Samuel felt the truth in the words. It wasn't just a promise, it was an oath forged in the fire of mutual risk. He gave a small nod, more moved than he'd care to admit. "I'll remember that." The girl stepped forward then, her small feet leaving prints in the soft earth. She looked up at Samuel, eyes bright despite the sadness of leaving. In halting English she whispered, "Thank you." Samuel knelt to meet her gaze. "You take care now," he said, the words catching in his throat. "Your pa's a good man. You'll be safe." She reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a single eagle feather, its shaft bound in red thread. She placed it in Samuel's hand and closed his fingers around it. "So you remember me," she said softly. He looked at the feather, feeling its lightness against his palm. "I'll keep it," he promised. With that, she turned and climbed onto her father's horse. Greyhawk swung up behind her, and with a signal to his men, the warriors began to move. The sound of hooves thundered across the plain, fading slowly into the distance until only the whisper of wind remained. Samuel stood alone again, the cabin at his back, the vast land before him. The quiet felt heavier now, not the peace of solitude, but the emptiness left when something important has gone. He glanced at the feather in his hand once more, its colors vivid against the roughness of his skin. Life on the frontier would go on. There would be cattle to tend, fences to mend, storms to ride out. But something had changed in Samuel Price. The world had felt small before, defined by his land and his work. Now it felt larger, wider, as if invisible threads connected him to people and places beyond his own horizon. That night, as the moon rose high and pale, Samuel placed the feather on the mantel above the hearth. The firelight danced across it, casting a long shadow on the wall. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat in his chair, listening to the night sounds, the coyotes in the distance, the creak of the old timbers in the wind. Somewhere out there, 70 warriors rode under the same moonlight. And if fate ever turned against him, he knew they would come. Until then, he would keep their oath.